ever get that feeling. Like, there's got to be more to reality than what we see and hear and touch. Like, what we experience every day is just, I don't know, scratching the surface.
Yeah, it's a feeling that's driven thinkers for, well, probably as long as humans have been around. And it's a feeling that takes us straight into the heart of Vedanta, which maybe we should clarify, isn't just one single idea. It's more like a whole landscape of thought with, different schools and approaches. I mean, it's one of the 6 classical systems of Indian philosophy, but it's also specifically a way of looking at the Upanishads, those ancient texts that are seen as the culmination of Vedic knowledge.
Okay, so it's kind of a big umbrella term, but also something more specific within that. And it's pretty important stuff, right? I mean, you don't devote a whole philosophical system to something trivial.
Oh, definitely not trivial. Vedanta is often considered like the peak, the high point of Indian philosophical thought. Super influential, still relevant today, probably the most well-known branch of Indian thought outside of India itself.
So where do we even start with all this? What are the must-read texts if you're going to dive into Vedanta?
Well, you've got 3 main ones. You have the Brahma Sutras, which are also sometimes called the Vedanta Sutras. Then there are the Upanishads themselves. And of course, you can't forget the Bhagavad Gita. Those 3 are like the foundation, the bedrock. Everything else builds on them.
And you mentioned different schools of thought, so I'm guessing there's been a lot of debate and interpretation going on around these texts over the centuries.
Oh yeah, tons. It's like you have scholars through the ages all looking at the same text and coming up with different ideas about what it means, particularly when it comes to the Brahma Sutras. That's where you get these distinct schools emerging. You've got Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, which is all about non-dualism. Then there's Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita, which is a kind of qualified non-dualism. And then there's Madhva's Dvaita, which is straight-up dualism. And of course, you can't forget Nimbarka's Dvaita, which tries to, bridge dualism and non-dualism. And then in more recent times, you've got Neo-Vedanta, which brings in some ideas from Western philosophy.
So a whole spectrum of viewpoints, but they all fall under the heading of Vedanta. So what is it that unites them? What's that common thread?
Well, at the core, they all see the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras as like the authoritative sources, and they're all ultimately trying to grapple with this idea of Brahman, the absolute, the ultimate reality. How they understand the relationship between Brahman and the individual soul, that's where the differences come in. But they all agree that Brahman is the source, the ground of everything.
And today, we're going deep on one of these schools in particular, right? Advaita Vedanta.
Exactly, Advaita Vedanta. And especially the way it was formulated by Shankara, the non-dualistic approach, it's just so central to Indian philosophy. It raises some really profound questions and some ideas that might seem counterintuitive at first.
So what is it about Advaita that makes it so unique, so different?
One of the most fascinating things is that it doesn't just accept our everyday waking experience as like the final truth. Normally we experience this separation. There's me, the knower, and then there's the world, the known. It's a subject-object split. But Advaita says, hey, wait a minute, maybe that's not the whole story. Maybe there's a deeper reality that we're not seeing. And to find it, we have to look beyond the waking state.
Which is kind of a different approach from a lot of Western philosophy, where we tend to start with what we observe in our waking state.
That's right. Western metaphysics often works within that framework of, subject and object. But Advaita says there's this 4th state of consciousness, they call it Turiya, and that's the real foundation. And to understand it, you have to look not just at waking, but also at dreaming, at deep sleep, and then at this state that transcends all 3, a state of pure consciousness without any separation.
And you mentioned they use the term Advaita non-duality instead of, say, unity. Why is that distinction important?
It's subtle, but it's crucial, because non-duality avoids this idea that there were 2 things to begin with that then became one. Even the word unity can kind of imply that there was a prior state of separation. Advaita is more like a radical negation of any division whatsoever. It's saying there never was a 2.
So if our normal waking experience isn't the ultimate reality, how does Advaita describe it? What's going on there?
Well, they see it as limited, as presenting a kind of illusory reality, but not in the sense that things don't exist at all. The illusion is in how we interpret things, in the limited perspective we have, shaped by our senses, our thoughts, our conditioning. I mean, think about it. Our senses only pick up a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum, right? We're only seeing a sliver of what's actually there.
An illusory reality. That's a big claim. So is there a way to break through this illusion?
That's what this idea of Turiya's 4th state of consciousness points to. It suggests that there's an absolute reality and an absolute truth that's accessible if we can move beyond our everyday perceptions, beyond the relative and, in a way, illusory reality of our normal dualistic consciousness.
It's interesting because there are some echoes of that in modern physics, right? I mean, when you get down to the quantum level, it seems like reality is more about relationships, probabilities, than about solid objects.
Right, and that's what's so fascinating is modern physics, especially microphysics, it seems to be pointing towards a reality that's more about interconnection, about dynamic processes, than about separate independent things. It's almost like the deeper we look, the more that solid separate world dissolves. And that aligns, in a surprising way, with this Advaita perspective.
And this is where the concept of Maya comes in, right? Which isn't some kind of magical illusion or anything like that.
Exactly. Maya, literally, it just means measure or relation. It's referring to how we perceive and structure reality through our limited, mental and sensory equipment. It's our way of understanding things, not the ultimate reality itself. It's that limited perspective that creates the illusion, not in the sense that things are unreal, but in the sense that they're not the whole picture.
So it's kind of like the map isn't the territory. The map is useful, but it's not the same as the actual place.
Perfect analogy. Our everyday experience is like the map, useful for navigating, but not the actual territory. And the territory, reality itself, is vastly more complex, more intricate than our mental maps can ever capture. It's like we're all looking at this territory through our own little window, which is, a bit foggy, and we're getting these different limited relative views.
So potentially lots of different relative realities. Wow. Okay, so how does understanding all this, how does understanding Advaita actually change things for us in our daily lives? What difference does it make?
Well, the power of Advaita is that it opens us up to possibilities that go beyond our usual subjective, limited experience, beyond just our senses, our interpretations, our memories. It suggests that there's this deeper level, this grounded being that's influencing everything. And if we can understand that, it can shift our whole perspective, our relationship to everything we experience.
But it does sound very, well, abstract, theoretical. Is this just for, philosophers and academics, or is there a practical side to it?
Oh, there's a very practical side. And Advaita actually addresses that directly. They make a distinction between the theoretical understanding and the practical realization. The theory is important, it gives you a framework, it clarifies the path. But the core of it, the essence of Advaita, is about actually verifying this truth for yourself.
Yeah.
Within your own consciousness.
So it's not about, scientific experiments, not about proving it in a lab.
Nope. The validation comes from within. It's about a deep, sustained inquiry into the nature of your own consciousness. And they distinguish this from, the more superficial, outward-focused consciousness that we usually operate with, the one that's shaped by our senses, by our thoughts.
And what's the outcome of that? What happens when we really look within in that way?
What you discover is a reality that's neither purely objective, out there, nor purely subjective, just in your head. It's consciousness itself. The underlying potential from which all these relative realities, all the names and forms like images flickering on a screen, arise and dissolve. And that, according to Advaita, that pure consciousness is the only absolute reality. And that's what they call Brahman.
Okay, so Brahman is this ultimate consciousness. What about us? What about the individual self, the Atman? Is that separate?
Well, the Atman is seen as the true self, the essence of each being. But in our normal experience, that true self is obscured. It's alienated. It's constantly directed outwards towards all these external sensations, images, objects.
So we're always looking outside, and in the process, we lose touch with who we really are.
Yeah, exactly. We get so caught up in the external world that we forget about our inner being. We only get these glimpses of it, these reflections. It's like, remember Plato's allegory of the cave, where the people only see shadows on the wall and they mistake those for the real objects?
And it's amazing how these ideas, they show up in different traditions and different cultures. There's a kind of universality to them, isn't there?
Right. And that's what people point to when they talk about the perennial philosophy, this idea that there are these core truths that keep recurring in different forms, in different languages, across time and cultures. These fundamental insights into reality, into consciousness, they seem to be universal.
So this illusion that we're caught in, Plato talked about it in terms of shadows created by the mind. What's the analogy in Advaita?
Well, they talk about the dualistic mind, the mind that's always creating divisions, separations. And the world we experience, the world of multiplicity, they see that as a projection of this dualistic mind. So the idea is that by turning inward, by going to the source of consciousness itself, we can start to perceive a reality that's non-dual, that's unified, And that's ultimately our true nature.
But who's doing the perceiving then? What happens to our sense of I, to the ego? Does that just disappear?
Well, the reason we don't recognize our true self, the Atman, is because we identify with all these changing things with our thoughts, our emotions, our physical body, and those are all impermanent. They're not the real I. The ego, that sense of separate self, it's part of the illusion.
And that's really relevant to our modern lives, isn't it? I mean, we're so focused on external things, on achievements, possessions. What's the message of Advaita for people living in this kind of world?
The message is stop looking for happiness in those external things, in objects, in achievements, in the things of the world. Look inward instead. Go to the source, to consciousness itself, because that's where everything you're seeking, that's where it truly resides.
A big shift in perspective, for sure. So how do we actually start to access this deeper state of consciousness? Are there specific techniques, practices that Advaita recommends?
There are, yeah, lots of them. Different forms of meditation, contemplation, self-inquiry, mindfulness practices, these are all tools that can help. But the point is, none of them are essential. The real key is what they call wisdom. It's a direct knowing that goes beyond just intellectual understanding.
Wisdom. So how do we cultivate that? It sounds like it's more than just, reading books and studying.
It's about really paying attention, observing what's happening within your own mind, your thought processes, how your mind works, how you experience sensations, how you react to pleasure and pain. The real practice, the core discipline, is this constant self-awareness.
A lifelong practice, that's a big commitment. Are there smaller steps we can take? Things we can do in our everyday lives that can start to move us in that direction?
Of course, every step counts. Even small things like spending time in nature, practicing a few minutes of meditation, being more mindful throughout your day. These can all help to create that connection with your inner being.
So those moments of peace, of clarity that we sometimes experience, those are like glimpses.
Exactly, little tastes of what's possible. And as you practice, you start to realize that everything you're looking for, happiness, joy, peace, love, it's all within you already.
And what about yoga? Does that have a place in Advaita?
Yeah, definitely. Especially the deeper aspects of yoga, beyond just the physical postures, because it helps to prepare the body and the mind. It sensitizes them, makes them more receptive. It's like the body and mind are the instruments we use for this inner exploration.
Sensitizing the instruments. I like that. What does that actually look like?
Well, it's about shifting your perspective. Imagine you're in a tall building. The view is very different depending on which floor you're on, right? It's the same with the mind. The more you yearn for truth, the deeper you go, the more your perspective changes.
So the people who feel that pull, that inner calling,
they tend to go deeper. They want to explore, to understand, whereas people who stay on the surface, they often stay stuck in that cycle of anxiety, always searching for something outside themselves.
And the more we find that fullness within, the less we need those external things, right?
Exactly. Discovering that inner completeness naturally leads to a detachment from chasing after external pleasures. And that's when the real exploration begins.
And that brings us to, well, something that most people are afraid of, death. What's the Advaita perspective on death?
Well, they say that understanding death is essential to understanding life. And the fear of death, it comes from not understanding reality, from identifying with the impermanent instead of with the eternal.
You told a story earlier about the rope and the snake. Maybe you could tell it again.
Sure. If you're walking in the dark and you see a coiled rope, you might mistake it for a snake. And that mistake, that illusion, will cause fear. But once you realize it's just a rope, the fear vanishes instantly. It's the same with death. We fear it because we misunderstand our true nature. We think we are the body, the ego, which are impermanent. But if we understand that our true self is beyond those things, the fear disappears.
We've talked a lot about Shankara. He seems to be such a key figure in Advaita. Can you tell us a bit more about his life?
Well, he's often considered the most important philosopher in India. And what's so remarkable about him is that he didn't just talk about philosophy. He lived it. He embodied the principles of Advaita in his own life.
So he was a living example of his teachings.
Absolutely. Even as a child, he was incredibly intelligent, and he had this deep thirst for spiritual truth. He renounced the conventional life early on, dedicated himself to studying and teaching the Vedic wisdom. He traveled all over India, debating with other philosophers, establishing monastic orders. He was completely committed to sharing his understanding.
And his writings are considered the foundation of Advaita, right?
Yes, he wrote these extensive commentaries on the Upanishads, on the Bhagavad Gita, and especially on the Brahma Sutras. Those commentaries, they're like the classic texts of Advaita Vedanta.
And he talked a lot about renouncing the world, but did that mean like rejecting everything material?
Well, he saw the world as Maya, an appearance, a superimposition on the true reality, which is Brahman. He said that everything we perceive as separate our bodies, objects, everything, it's all transient. It arises from ignorance. The goal is to realize that I am Brahman, to recognize your true identity as pure consciousness.
And there's that story you told about the king and the elephant, which kind of illustrates that, right?
So this king, he was a disciple of Shankara, and he was having trouble reconciling his experience of power, of reality, with this idea that everything is unreal. So Shankara, to make a point, he had this elephant, this angry elephant, let loose in the king's direction. And the king, naturally, he ran away in fear. Later he asked Shankara, why was I afraid? If everything is unreal, why did I react like that? And Shankara said, well, the elephant was unreal from the perspective of absolute reality, but so was your fear, and so was my instruction to the elephant handlers. Like, even though we understand the ultimate unreality, we still have to function within this relative reality.
So it's not about denying our experience, but about understanding it on a deeper level.
Exactly. And Shankara's life, it was all about that, about seeking truth. He renounced the world not because he hated it, but because he understood its true nature. And it's interesting because there are parallels between his teachings and, Buddhism and other wisdom traditions. This idea of transcending the illusion, it seems to be universal.
He had a specific idea about what a renunciant was, right? It wasn't just anyone who decided to, give up their possessions.
Right. For him, a renunciant, a sannyasin, was someone with a real vocation for truth.
Yeah.
Someone who's willing to step outside the normal rules and expectations of society because they've recognized the illusory nature of the world. It's not about escaping, it's about freedom.
And he founded these monasteries all across India. What was the purpose of those?
They were meant to be places where people could dedicate themselves to the practice of Advaita, places for meditation, contemplation, study. We often associate monasteries with Buddhism, but Shankara's monasteries are still around today. And the heads of those monasteries, they're still called Shankaracharya.
So renunciation in Advaita, it's not about deprivation or suffering.
Not at all. It's about letting go of what you realize is unreal. It's like if you're carrying around a heavy rock and you suddenly realize it's hollow, you would just drop it, right?
But what happens when someone starts to have that realization? What changes for them?
Well, they experience a profound peace, a sense of freedom, of liberation. And because they no longer see themselves as separate, they start to experience love and compassion in a much deeper way. The barriers break down.
We talked earlier about this ultimate state of consciousness, Turiya. How does that relate to all this?
Turiya is beyond the usual states of consciousness. Waking, dreaming, deep sleep. It's a state of pure awareness, and it's often described as emptiness. Not in a negative sense, but in the sense that there's no subject-object duality, no separation. In that state, you experience Brahman directly.
That sounds a bit like the Buddhist concept of emptiness, sunyata.
There's definitely a connection. Sunyata, it means emptiness of inherent existence, emptiness of all those illusory separations that we create. And that emptiness is not a void, it's the ground of being. It's the fullness of reality.
So reality ultimately is beyond our normal categories.
It is. It transcends those dualistic categories of empty and not empty, but we can use the word empty to point to the fact that it's empty of all those illusory things, empty of separation. And this idea, it resonates with other traditions too. Taoism, for example, or other schools of Hinduism. They all point to this ultimate reality, this absolute. And in Advaita, the key point is that this absolute, this Brahman, it's not separate from you. It's your true nature.
It all comes back to that interconnectedness.
Yes. Realizing your true self, the Atman, is the same as realizing Brahman. And when that happens, all the limitations, all the anxieties, they fall away.
What about time? How does Advaita view time in relation to this absolute reality?
Well, Brahman is beyond time. And our intuition, it often tells us that we are also connected to something eternal. But our thinking minds, they're always pulling us out of the present moment, into the past with memories, or into the future with worries and desires. Practices like meditation, they help us to come back to the now.
And we experience the present as so fleeting. Why is that?
Because we're constantly moving away from it. We're either dwelling on the past or worrying about the future, or never really here.
So the present moment, for our thinking minds, it's just a point on a timeline.
Right. But beyond thought, there's this eternal present, this now that's always here. It's like your breath. It's just there in the present moment. Always.
Western philosophy seems to focus a lot on duality. Are these non-dualistic ideas unique to Eastern traditions?
Well, there are wisdom traditions all over the world that emphasize non-duality. But in India, these ideas have been a central part of the culture for a very long time, so maybe they're more prominent there.
You mentioned a figure who came before Shankara, Gaudapada. What was his contribution?
Gaudapada was Shankara's grand teacher, and he's seen as the first person to really systematize Advaita Vedanta. He wrote these commentaries called the Karikas on the Mandukya Upanishad. And that Upanishad, it's all about the four states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and turiya.
And those commentaries were important for Shankara.
Very important. Shankara's whole philosophical system was built on Gaudapada's work.
What was Gaudapada's main message?
Non-duality. He said that reality is ultimately one. There's no real separation. And he echoed this idea from the Upanishads, that nothing is truly born and nothing truly dies.
So it all goes back to the Upanishads.
Yes, the Upanishads are the source. They're these dialogues between teachers and students full of wisdom and insights. And Shankara, he took that wisdom and he systematized it using the framework that Gaudapada had developed.
Is there an example from the Upanishads that really shows this idea of non-duality?
There's a beautiful dialogue in the Chandogya Upanishad between a sage named Uddalaka Aruni and his son, Svetakatu. And the father, he's teaching the son about the nature of reality. And he says, Tavamasi, which means you are that. You are that ultimate reality.
You are that. That's a powerful statement.
It is. And real understanding, it's not just intellectual, it's intuitive, it's a direct experience. And it comes from contemplation, from living with that truth. And eventually, the separation between the observer and the observed, it dissolves completely.
It's a journey of self-discovery.
It is. And it's a journey worth taking. Because what you discover is your own true nature, your own infinite potential.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you.
And maybe one last thought to leave you with. There's a passage in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad where the sage Yajnavalkya says, where there is duality, as it were, there one sees another, one smells another, one tastes another, one speaks to another, one hears another, one thinks of another, one touches another. But when for one everything has become just one's own self, then what could one smell and through what? What could one see and through what? What could one hear and through what? What could one speak and through what? What could one think and through what? What could one touch and through what? It really makes you think, doesn't it, about what it means to perceive, to know, to be when everything becomes one.
Thank you. I think we all have a lot to ponder on after that.